They burned the city to ash, and still the bronzes glowed. In the smoke and the thunder of guns, in the crackle of palaces turning to cinders, something older than fire refused to die. The British called it a punitive expedition. The survivors called it the end of the world. But the bronzes watched with metal eyes, silent witnesses to a truth everyone thought they could bury. Greatness and terror live side by side. Behind the glitter, behind the coral beads and the carved ivory, behind golden stools and towering stone walls, lay a darkness so carefully hidden it took centuries to name. We tell ourselves we know how empires rise. We don't always admit what keeps them in the air. This is not a single place, not a single people, not a single story. It's a map of kingdoms that once pulsed across a continent, from rainforests to savannas, from delta swamps to dry highlands. The Aba of Benin raising court and halls hung with brass reliefs. The kings of Dahomey and Abumi draped in red, gripping ritual swords. The Alafin of Oyo weighing his life in a calabash. The Ashanti bathing gold in light, guarding a sacred stool that did not touch the ground. The kings of Congo writing letters to Europe with a quill and a worried heart. The sultans of the Swahili coast counting ivory tusks like white moons. The builders of great Zimbabwe laying stones so tight you could not slide a blade between them. They traded, they fought, they sang the past and ruled the present. They built roads and moats and markets, minted coins and crowned heirs. They were not blank spaces on anyone's map. And like every court that ever breathed, they kept their power by mixing dream and dread. If you listen closely, you hear the truth these kingdoms left behind. It isn't just drums and dancers. It's the whisper you ignore when the music stops. But what was the price of all that splendor, really? What promises were sealed in blood behind palace walls? What did it take to feed gods and crown kings? Who did the work? Who paid the debt? And who never returned home? How did desire twist into duty when a monarch wanted more than a loyal general could give? Why do the most beautiful objects sometimes come wrapped in the cruelest silence? And here's the question that scrapes like a blade down a stone. Are we brave enough to look without flinching at them? And at us? Before you say yes, remember, every empire tells a story of glory. The old ones, the forgotten ones, leave footnotes in ashes, bones, and bronze. And footnotes don't stay quiet forever. In Benin, the art dazzled. Brass and bronze cast by lost wax masters told a court's life in fine lines and hammered patterns, warriors leaning into battle. The oboe wearing coral like a sea around his throat, Portuguese traders in funny hats, a world made eternal in metal. But in the shadow of that brilliance stood shrines heavy with expectations, altars loaded with the need to keep an empire's bargain with the ancestors. European accounts and local oral histories both speak in different voices of human lives, offered when the realm demanded power, captives taken in war, criminals judged beyond pardon, blood sent as a message to those who had gone before. How many? The numbers fight each other in dusty books. But the fact that it happened at all and that the British made an empire's worst days into the justification for plunder hums under the surface of every museum's quiet. In 1897, the night the British marched on Benin City, flames ate palaces, groves, and histories. They carried off the bronzes that had watched everything. The secret they could not carry was the simple one, a court that beautiful was not born from innocence, and an empire that burned it did not come clean to the fire. Turn west, and you hear drums that sound like a heartbeat under thunder. Abumi, Dahomey, kings like Gasso and Gliel stitched their power from a cloth of fear and wealth, and the thread, was human lives. The annual customs were more than a festival. They were a ledger, tribute paid to gods and ancestors. The palace courtyard became a theater for sacrifice and spectacle, where prisoners raided from neighboring towns, dragged from far hinterlands, sometimes ended as offerings to feed the state's spiritual hunger. The women warriors, the Agaji, stamped their feet in cadence, fierce as a storm. They were real and they were terrifying, sworn to the king, carrying long blades and iron will. Did they fight to protect their land? Yes. Did their campaigns feed the slave trade that fed their treasury? Also yes. The king's wealth rose with the price of a child on a foreign ship. When the world asked Dahomey to stop, its rulers sometimes replied that the trade was the kingdom's breath. It's a sentence you can barely say out loud without tasting rust. Further inland, Oyo's cavalry ate distances like a fly swallowing. The sky, the empire stretched wide, capping towns with a net of tribute and fear. Yet inside the palace, the most dangerous enemy a king faced might be his own council. The Oyo Messi, led by the Besoran, could present the Alafin with an empty calabash or parrot's eggs, the quiet order to take his own life. The prince, the Aremo, was expected to die with his father to shorten the line of claimants and lengthen the life of the state. Think about that. A realm where the crown was a weight that could crush a man without a single sword being drawn. There was a Besoran, Gaha, whose name still chills the tongue. He made and unmade kings until the people rose and burned his power to ash. Oyo's secret wasn't just military might. It was the cold ritual that kept politics moving like the gears of a clock even if it ground flesh into time. In Ashanti lands, gold flashed like sun trapped in earth. The golden stool, they said, fell from the sky, holding the soul of the nation, sacred enough to make men shake. Courts staged ceremonies so precise that a heartbeat out of place felt like treason. Foreigners wrote breathless reports about human sacrifice at royal funerals, about sword testing on bound bodies, about rivers of blood. Did they exaggerate to shock Europe and justify conquest? Often, yes. Were there captives killed at great funerals, deaths demanded to mark a king's passage or to water the graves? In some periods, yes, and it stains the memory of glory. This is the tightrope, a culture with philosophy, art, iron discipline, and rituals that took lives in the name of tradition. These things can coexist. They often do. It's easier to tell a simple story. It's harder and more honest to hold both truths in your hands and feel their weight. Travel south, and the Congo kingdom reads like a heartbreak letter. King Afonso wrote to Portugal warning that his people were vanishing into the maw of a trade he could not control. Baptized, pen in hand, counting on Christian brotherhood and treaties, he watched slavers and local chiefs rip holes in his country big enough for an ocean to pour through. Then civil wars came. In the early 1700s, a young woman, Donna Beatrice Kempa Veda, launched a spiritual revolt Christ as a Congolese, saint speaking Kikongo, a vision of redemption that pulled crowds into her orbit. She was burned at the stake by her own king. The smoke that rose from her death was not just the end of a rebel, it was the signal that a people's soul was being argued over with fire. On the shores of Lake Victoria, Buganda's court glittered. The Kabaka commanded thousands, his word law. But desire and power tangled there in a way that turned private rooms into battlefields. In the late 19th century, Page's young men serving in the palace were ordered into acts they resisted. Their refusals, bound up with new religions and old authority, ended in flames at Namugongo, the Uganda martyrs the world calls them now. What do you call it when the intimate becomes the Instrument of rule? When loyalty is measured in the language of a bedroom and answered with a pyre. It was a scandal then, it's a wound now, and it's a reminder that politics is never just about thrones and flags. It is badas. It is breath. Follow the coast, and the air turns sharp with clove and salt. Zanzibar, Kilwa, Mombasa, names that taste like trade. Ivory left forest edges and long, moving linesmen, women, children yoked together, marching to a rhythm of whip cracks and debt. Swahili and Arab merchants counted fortunes as sultans' ledgers swelled. In the interior, powerful men brokered badas for gunpowder and cloth. Tippa-Tip, famous and feared, wrote a memoir you can still buy. The pages are calm, almost gentle. The reality behind them is not. When gold boomed, tusks gleamed white in European parlors. When fashion shifted, flesh paid the difference. Sometimes that flesh was someone's brother. Sometimes it was someone's child. And then there is stone. Great Zimbabwe rises from the ground like a puzzle whose answer you want to be beautiful, all genius and no shadow. The walls curve. The granite sings in light. For centuries, people debated why it was abandoned, why the birds carved from soapstone look like warnings. The painful truth, the biggest horror here, may not be in how the kingdom lived, but in how its memory was stolen. A white mythology once insisted real Africans couldn't have built it. Scholars were silenced, artifacts smuggled away. A theft as cold as any blade, erase a people's authorship, and you don't need to conquer their ruins. You've already claimed their mind. None of this is simple. And if anyone tells you the cruelty here belongs to one continent, one color, one faith, they're lying. Human sacrifice? Found in Mexico, Europe, Asia, slavery. As old as the First Empire, everywhere a ship could sail or a road could reach. Eunuchs guarded courts in China, in Byzantium, in Bornu. Ritual regicide echoes from Scandinavia to the savannas. What makes these stories forgotten isn't the acts themselves. It's that a million school books pretend the only empires worth tears are the ones with columns and togas. Meanwhile, skulls were counted in palaces made of red earth and rain, and the drums we romanticize often kept time with a march no one wants to remember. Peek behind the screens of these palaces, and you meet power at its most intimate. Kings with hundreds of wives and concubines built alliances with beds as much as with swords. The Queen Mother Ioba in Benin sat in cool, shadowed rooms, pulling threads you could not see, shaping succession with a whisper in the Sahel. And in Central African courts, eunuchs, boys cut in body and steeled in spirits, stood at doorways and in corridors, the gatekeepers of chambers where policy and passion coiled together. Their pain was the price of a monarch's trust. In some Yoruba towns, secret societies like the Ogboni weighed justice in rooms where iron figures watched, and oaths were sealed in language thicker than blood. Tales swirl around Queen Nzinga. Of Ndongo and Matamba, the warrior monarch who outfoxed Europeans and African rivals alike. Missionaries wrote that she kept male concubines dressed as women and made them fight to the death for her bed, that she sat on the back of a human being when no stool was offered. Are these stories true? Scholars argue. Some say propaganda. Some say fragments of truth wrapped in scandal. But the fact these tales stuck tells you something about how power was imagined, not only as a spear, but as a taboo broken, a boundary crossed, a rumor you could never quite prove or shake. The palace was a machine that turned love into leverage. Marriages sealed treaties. A smile could be a treaty. A child born at the right time could silence an army. In Baganda, pages found that refusal wasn't just sedition. It was heresy, it was treason, it was a death sentence. In Dahomey, women drilled until their hands were calloused, until their bodies were law, until the king slept with a wall around him made of lungs and loyalty and steel. In Oyo, the king's last intimate act might be to accept the calabash and step into death quietly, because sometimes mercy isn't loud. This was the private arithmetic of rule. It is as old as crowns and as raw as any scar. Then came consequences, a deluge that washed red soil into deeper seas. Europeans stepped into the cracks and forced them wider, dangling guns and gold in front of chiefs and kings already tied to markets and people. The British used the specter of sacrifice and barbarity to justify burning Benin and carting away its art. The French, the Portuguese, the Germans, the Belgians each claimed to bring civilization to polities that had been calculating civilization's cost for centuries. Old rivalries were weaponized. Routes for ivory and slaves became roads for invasion. Kingdoms that had thrived on trade were trapped in treaties they could not survive. Some rulers bent, some broke, some fought and died. The slave trade morphed into colonial labor systems wearing a different uniform. Names changed. Chains didn't, and yet the aftermath hums with more than pain. The Agaji are remembered now not just as instruments of a king's hunger, but as women who fought, who held a blade in a world where they were not supposed to. Benin's bronzes stare out of glass cases in London and Berlin, and the countries that hold them argue, and the countries that made them demand their return, and something like justice whispers on the wind. The golden stool survived armies and insults, and its story still holds a people together. In Congo, Donna Beatrice's dream flows into new movements, new songs. Great Zimbabwe stones still stand. School children visit with notebooks in their hands instead of being told a lie. But the cost echoes every time a shipwreck is found on the seabed with chains still intact. Every time a family name in Brazil or South Carolina echoes a lineage that began under a different sun. So what do we do with horror that beautiful things hid? We speak it aloud, without excuses that turn bodies into footnotes. Without the lazy relief of saying it was all Europeans or it was all Africans. Without flinching at the way desire becomes a weapon in the right hands and piety becomes a knife when power needs cutting. We admit that the same people who carved wonder out of brass could order a life to end with a gesture. We admit that a king might keep the peace by killing himself. We admit that a queen might win a war by making the rumor of her bed more terrifying than her army. We admit it, and we keep going. Because there is no other way to tell the truth. Listen. The ruins are not quiet. Markets in Ouida, moats in Benin, courtyards in Abemi, the ash field at Namagongo, the curve of the great enclosure they all remember. The bronzes remember the heat that tried to unmake them and failed. The stones remember hands, yes, but also orders. The drums remember funerals where captives did not return. If we call these kingdoms forgotten, it is because forgetting feels safer than knowing. But safety has always been a poor historian. Stand still, hear it. The horrific secrets of Africa's forgotten kingdoms are not whispers out of the past. They are mirrors held up to the present. What we do with that reflection is the last secret we get to keep.